look back at what I think is the only loss by the Packers on this schedule, but it was still a very important game. And I thought it was worth going back and watching and talking about because, additionally, I don't know how many of our fans actually got to watch this game live. I am talking about the 2007 Week 13 game where the Packers, on a Thursday night, traveled to Dallas to take on the Cowboys. Brett Favre still the starter, Aaron Rodgers the backup. The game on NFL Network. And NFL Network was having lots of disputes with lots of different cable couriers throughout the country. So I don't know how many people watch this. As we welcome in our guest for this one, who were you there in Dallas, Jason? Were you down there for this game?
You bet I was. I absolutely was at Texas Stadium on November 29th, 2007. And interesting that you bring that up because we know the NFL designates home markets for each game that is not on over-the-air television. So because this was on NFL Network and because Green Bay is the only franchise that has technically two home markets, they have Milwaukee and Green Bay, that means that a Green Bay station and a Milwaukee station each get to carry the game, the NFL Network feed, on their television station over the air. So I wasn't in Madison. I wasn't in Milwaukee. I wasn't in Green Bay. I was in Dallas. But I was writing for readers in Madison. And they didn't have any access because they were not a home market. So if you did not have NFL Network, and I don't think you did, you didn't get to watch this game. So great choice. I'm not sure I'm thrilled being the only one who's doing this with you on a game that was a loss, but be that as it may, I'm happy to be part of it.
Here we are. So I was a senior in college, and I had for this game. And I remember, so everybody went, like, because nobody had NFL Network in Platteville. Platteville, not a home market for the Green Bay Packers, as you mentioned. So we had one sports bar in Platteville. We had the ticket. So everybody had to go there. The problem was, at this point of the calendar, we didn't have baseball practices, but there was a conditioning class that our coach taught. And that's kind of how we got around, like, not being able to have technically baseball practice. You know, we all had this conditioning class, and it's earlier in Thursday evening. So I had to have buddies, the buddies I lived with who were not on the baseball team, go to the ticket and save me a seat. So I could actually go to the one sports bar in Platteville to be able to watch this game. And it was a highly anticipated game, Jason. Both these teams were 10-1 heading into this game. Mike McCarthy's second year. Brett Favre is an MVP candidate. In fact, he would be the only one to receive an MVP vote other than Tom Brady, prevented Brady from being a unanimous MVP at the end of the season. That's how good Brett Favre was playing. He had turned back the clock, so everybody was excited for this game. And it got off to an okay start. Brett played all right, but then Brett just started kind of falling into some bad habits and just constantly chucking the ball down the field. And it was interesting. So, but also Bryant Gumbel and Chris Collinsworth were on the call for NFL Network. Bryant Gumbel, I'm glad he does real sports. He's really good at that. I think there's a reason why he's not doing play-by-play for NFL games anymore. Just a little stiff, but it was clearly part of the Packers' game plan to throw the football early and often against this Cowboys defense. And for whatever reason, Brett was just airing it out, chucking it deep. The first drive, again, it went well for the Packers, and it seemed like they were in an early feeling out process. The way I remembered the game before I went back and watched it was that Brett played terrible for the entire portion of the game that he was in. That's not true. The first couple of drives, he was okay, and then things went downhill quickly because of the pressure the Cowboys got on him.
So I went back and watched the game as well because you told me to. But I remember it pretty clearly, and so I didn't necessarily need the refresher. But I think the reason why so many people thought that he'd played poorly was because they were down 27-10 at the time that Rodgers went in. And to your point, as I watched it, you're right. They did not start as poorly as that score would indicate. The opening drive, they go down, they end up settling for a field goal, but he makes a throw to Donald Driver over his shoulder that Donald Driver probably should make the catch on.
Mm-hmm.
And it should be a touchdown because the defender is on him, but the ball gets through and it actually hits him in kind of the chest plate and the hands. And so instead of 7-0, it's 3-0, and then it's 3-3. So it is not a great start, but to your point about the chucking, I think you just used the phrase "turn back the clock." I called it. I remember very vividly when I would talk about this team that year, that Favre was having a renaissance season,
Mm-hmm.
because he was playing like the MVP that he had been in 96, 97, 98. His interception total that year plummeted.
Yeah.
And so he was really playing well. And then to your point about what happened in this game, it's actually, and I know we're going chronologically through the game, but like Ryan Grant has a long touchdown run. It's like 13-10.
Yeah.
At the end of the first quarter. So it's not as if they were out of the game by any stretch. And one of the reasons why it was 13-3 before Grant's touchdown run is Favre threw one of those kind of Philadelphia style 4th and 26 game interceptions where he throws it up for grabs and it's like waiting for a punt to come down for the defender.
The other, before we get to the part where Aaron Rodgers comes in, there were a couple of things that kind of stood out to me. One, at one point, there's a TO completion near the sideline. Al Harris,
Yep,
grabs the ball away from him before TO goes out. Should have been an interception, but the official said, "Hey, we stopped. We said that forward progress had stopped." McCarthy still challenged it, but then I got to hear Bryant Gumbel utter the words "new interpretation of the catch rule." So it's good to know. It's almost comforting to know that we've been trying to debate what a catch is in the NFL for almost 20 years now. Like there's something a little bit comforting about that, even though it shouldn't be, because they've been, and it came into play later because Alfasano, the tight end, thought he had caught the ball in the end zone, but he went to the ground, didn't complete the process of the catch. Again, debating, the NFL debating what a catch is since the year 2007. And the other thing that really stood out to me here, Jason, is even though it got stale at the end, early Mike McCarthy, and I know we talked about this at times on the radio, but early Mike McCarthy had so many different sets that he would go to, so many different formations, different, they went as much as 5 wide, which they loved doing that year, especially after Corin Robinson came in. And also in the first quarter, they had a full house backfield where they had 2 fullbacks and Ryan Grant. Like they had just so much versatility with what they could do offensively. And I think it's easy for a lot of Packers fans to kind of forget that, given how 2017, 2018 went, where it seemed like things had kind of gotten stale and they would just get stagnant with their 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, 1 running back.
So it's interesting. The day that we're taping this, I actually spent some time with Mike McCarthy before he headed back to Dallas. And when I look back on his tenure, I remember very vividly one of the things that was most important to him was personnel changes. And very rarely, unless it was the 2-minute drill, would they go with the same personnel group 2 consecutive plays. I mean, you look back on this game, not just this game, but lots of games, it's shuttling guys in and out literally every play. And then as Rodgers kind of developed, and obviously in this game, he's not even the starter, but we'll talk about what he does in this game in a moment. But as he developed and they really liked the no huddle and they saw how good Rodgers was at the line of scrimmage, they started to be very stagnant with their personnel because they were not huddling and they wanted to stick with 3 wides, a tight end and a back to go fast, get their best players on the field and maximize Rodgers' ability there. And let's be honest, during 2011, which was kind of the start of the no huddle phase, and then it really became, they went, and Mike even admits this to this day, then they went too much to that. And so he acknowledges that. But it was so effective for them that in 2011, pretty hard to argue that they weren't really good in no huddle situations. Dude won his first of his 4 MVPs. But the other thing that I noticed, and this gets lost to history too, and I did not remember this. I remember that game very vividly because look, that was also at a point in my relationship with Rodgers where during '05 when he was a rookie, I had this big argument with Favre in the locker room in which he confronted me while I was talking to Rodgers about something, and he and I are yelling at each other, and that's kind of the start of my relationship with Rodgers. Well, by 2007, like when there was nothing going on in the locker room and I didn't need to interview somebody, he and I were talking. Like we people like to make fun of it or call me a toady or whatever else, but he and I really had a connection long before he was the starter, and for no other purpose other than we're two reasonably smart guys who like to talk to each other. That was it. So when he got the opportunity to play in this game, I'm not saying that I was cheering for him in the press box because I still maintain my professional decorum. But this was the moment that I was kind of waiting for. I really wanted to see, is this guy as good as I think he could be based on what I've seen in the practices that I was allowed to see? Remember, just like now with Jordan Love, we didn't get to watch in-season 11 on 11 practice periods. This was after we had started getting kicked out for 11 on 11 during the regular season. And so I did not get to see all those things that he would do on the scout team with Ravel Martin and everybody else, and where the belt was born and everything else. And so I knew what I'd seen in training camp in '07. I knew what I'd seen in preseason in '07. He was a stud. He was a really, really good player. I didn't know he was going to be a Hall of Fame player, but I could sense in '07 that if Favre was bad in '07, or if he called it quits, they were in a good place. Not how I feel currently about the shift, but I was really excited when he went trotting onto the field with them down 27-10 with 9 minutes and change left in the first half. And like you said, this was a big game. They're down 17, and they're both 10-1, and they're vying for the number 1 seed.
So the way it just to kind of add more layers to this. So Brett gets hurt with 10-11 left, was intercepted on the play because he got hit. Like he got hit in his right arm, forearm, elbow area from a helmet on a blitzing defender. Ball floated out there, ended up getting intercepted by the Cowboys. They put it in the end zone to take that 27-10 lead. And what then would ensue, I feel, is just so important for Rodgers. Because even though he was good in all those situations you described, Jason, and I'm sure he was pretty good in a lot of those 11 out of 11s, and Collinsworth at some point in the broadcast, makes the reference of how he had to pretend to be Tony Romo through the practice periods because he was the scout team quarterback for the Packers. But the thing that I remember going into this game is there were still a lot of questions, even though he's a first round pick, because you've got Brett Favre, who's like the ultimate tough guy in NFL history. It was 249 starts at this point, I believe, that he just continued to always play, or whatever the number was in terms of consecutive starts for Brett. And Aaron, in the limited playing time that he had gotten in previous seasons, just was unfortunate with injuries. I think there was a hamstring in there. I think he played against the Patriots the year before and broke his foot.
Played the entire second half on a broken foot.
Yeah. But that's not the part that gets looked at. Like, oh, he played with a broken foot. It's like, oh man, this guy got a broken foot. He's, I feel like there was talk amongst the fan base, like, okay, can this guy stay healthy enough if he even eventually takes over for Brett?
Yeah.
So the next 2.5 quarters that Aaron Rodgers would play, I feel were so important for him. And I understand a lot of the fan base was still with Brett once we hit the off season and, training camp the following year. But this was the first time, at least for me, that I went, ooh, maybe they have something here. Even though it started poorly, he was 1 of 4. They tried to get him an easy completion early on a little rollout. Pressure got in his face. Ball got batted down. But as the game progressed, like you could see some of the things that you were just talking about, Jason. Although it took me a while watching this game back, his mechanics were still not the mechanics that we get to see when he becomes the 4-time MVP. Because if fans remember, coming out of the Jeff Tedford system, he would always have the ball up by the ear hole, so you're going back, ball's up by the ear hole. Well, the hands are a little bit lower, but it's still a little stiff as he kind of drops back to pass. And that was one of the first things that kind of stood out to me that I kind of forgotten about in terms of how much of the mechanics that Mike McCarthy cleaned up for Aaron Rodgers to get him to the point where he became what is now a 4-time MVP.
Yeah, and Tom Clements, and that relates to where we're at today, even though we're going back, in time 16 years. One of the things that I've talked about with a lot of people in the building and outside the building, Tom Clements' return was not just great for Aaron Rodgers to have his consigliere back. It has been transformative for Jordan Love as he develops his mechanics and improves them. And that's one of the things we'll be watching this season about how Jordan Love plays are his feet in rhythm, and is he getting the ball out on time and on rhythm, all those types of things that you see Rodgers do somewhat in this game. Look, and I've told this story before. They get to the NFC Championship game later this year, and the famous story that Mike McCarthy never wanted told and had been told privately, and then Tom Pelissero of the NFL Network shared it publicly, so now we all share it publicly, was that he said at halftime as they're struggling against the Giants and Favre was playing so poorly in the cold, if I had any guts at all, he did not use guts, he used a different word.
It's a family show.
I'd bench this guy and put the kid in. And for me, it's the greatest what if of my career. It's not what if, they beat the Broncos in Super Bowl 32. It's not 4th and 26. It's not even the loss in Seattle, which remains to me even worse than 4th and 26. Like that is the worst loss I ever covered. If you're a Packers fan, but that said, the biggest what if is what if he had put Rodgers in the NFC Championship game later this season. So as we talk about Rodgers, the other two things, I know you fill in on Carlin and Canty and Carlin a lot. Chris Canty's on the field.
He's on the field.
And then Mike McCarthy does one of those sneak attack onside kicks after they score to go to 13-10. And I think it might hit off Kuhn
it hit off Kuhn. It just like grazed Kuhn's elbow. Otherwise, they would have had the perfect surprise onside kick.
Right, and they've got the ball back. So those were two things before Rodgers goes in that jumps out. But man, oh man, as I watched in preparation for this, the time that Favre was on the field for, he had a couple of balls that should have been intercepted that weren't.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's a flea flicker they run that he throws up for grabs that fortunately he overthrows. The next play he throws into triple coverage and the defensive back drops an interception there. Like it was going back to our early conversation so we can get to Rodgers. That was when it was almost like he had turned back the clock to playing great, and then he turned the clock ahead slightly to those times when he was throwing those boneheaded up for grabs interceptions that had become so commonplace after that miraculous night in Oakland, which I know is another repackable.
Yeah,
right?
we just did that one with Tausch. Yep.
Where everything he threw, they came up with. And while that is the greatest game I ever covered, and I'm going on year 28 here, that is the most magical moment I've ever seen was what they did that night. I still maintain that it was also one of the worst things that could happen because everything he threw up for grabs, Javon Walker, Robert Ferguson, Wesley Walls, whoever it was, came down with it. And he started doing that entirely too often thereafter, and they didn't come down with it. The other team usually did.
Yeah, and McCarthy reined him in, and so Brett gets hurt, and Rodgers comes in, and again, it's 27-10. And I feel in most situations, young kids coming in, yeah, it's his third year, but he doesn't have a lot of experience under his belt. Clearly hasn't started a game because Brett never missed a start. So I feel like in most situations, a lot of teams would, okay, we just got to run the football. But that's not what the Packers were. they're on a short week. Like if this game's on a Sunday, maybe they pivot, but it's a short week. It's a short game plan. Like we just kind of it felt like McCarthy decided, hey, we just got to run what we had game planned for in the short week. And they continued to throw the ball, which Rodgers kind of went back to, and Chris Collinsworth made a note of this if you go back and watch the game. He's like, ever since Rodgers has been in, this is the Packers offense that's had so much success. Throw it underneath. Let Greg Jennings, which, by the way, I know Greg Jennings did not make a lot of Packers fans happy when he left. And since he's left, he hasn't done himself any favors. He's now in the Packers Hall of Fame. Prime Greg Jennings was a lot of fun to watch in this game. Like he did, I mean, him with the ball in his hands was a lot of fun to watch. And you could see the magic that existed between him and Rodgers, I think, even this early. But Rodgers just kind of settled himself down by hitting those underneath throws and kind of spreading it around. But it was Jennings who made a couple of the big plays, including the first career touchdown throw for Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah, and look, it's certainly a memorable game for a lot of reasons. And Greg Jennings does a lot of work on that first touchdown, frankly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does a lot of the heavy, kind of like maybe Christian Watson did the same for Jordan Love on his touchdown in Philly last year. But what always strikes me about how Rodgers plays in this game, because there are also some times when he does what young quarterbacks do, which is goes through his progressions maybe faster than he wants to or not fast enough, and he's got to pull the ball down and go. And you see some of that. You also see him diving headfirst, not being careful to protect himself. And I remember sitting in the press box at Texas Stadium knowing the durability question, right?
Yeah.
He had the torn hamstring. He had the broken foot. And I remember thinking, oh, come on, man. Like, you got to protect yourself because the other guy has Kurt Fielding over on the sideline massaging his elbow, trying to get feeling back in it. He ain't coming back, and you got to stay healthy. You cannot suffer an injury here. So he takes some risks, but he you know, and I'm sure we'll get to this as we go on, but this was not for the Packers. Oh, maybe we have something here, like it was for you in the ticket in downtown Platteville. This was confirmation that this guy was who they thought he was.
And you can just see this confidence grow. So they score the touchdown with Greg Jennings, and it's 27-17 at half. And they go into the second half. The defense played awful. First half, they were without Charles Woodson. They had picked on Jarrett Bush to the point where the Packers decided to put Tramon Williams in, which was obviously a good move for Tramon in his career in the second half. Because even Al Harris struggled against Terrell Owens in that game. T.O. had over 100 yards just a minute into the second quarter. But the Cowboys have the ball. They march it down. We're still unsure if Favre's going to play in the second half. He's wearing a sleeve on the elbow. Obviously doesn't come back in. The Packers get on 4th and 2. The Cowboys go for it in field goal range. Packers stuff it, and they take back over. And this is the drive where I think you start to see that confidence for Aaron Rodgers. He is sacked on the first play, but then manages to get first downs. And then later in this drive, he has what I would call almost the first vintage Aaron Rodgers play, where he rolls out of the pocket to the right, can't find anybody. And I feel most young quarterbacks in this situation, Jason, would just throw it away. Instead, he holds on to it. I wouldn't say it's a cardinal sin for Tom Clements because he didn't throw it late. Definitely threw it over the middle, a little bit across his body, but Donald Lee was open. He hits Lee for a big gain because he held on to the ball that helped keep that drive going for the Packers.
Yeah, and you know, you look at some of the things he does in this game, you know, talk about foreshadowing. There's also a play on this at the start of the drive that ends in the touchdown to Jennings where it's supposed to be a toss play to a running back, and Rodgers turns around and the running back is gone.
Yep.
And so he just sort of okay. And then the foreshadowing part is, I don't know who he's yelling at, but he's yelling at somebody as they go back to the huddle. So, but it's interesting because you know, we'll get to that other drive, but the the play that you're talking about, in fact, I'm rewatching it right now where he buys time to his right
Yep.
and then hits Donald Lee as he comes open across the middle. Um, he looks so calm.
Yes.
He looks so in control, and I think that's one of the things that's such an important glimpse into the future. Now, again, that it's temporary, right? Like we don't know if it's going to be how he's going to be for the rest of his career. All we know is what's happening in real time, and I'm sitting there writing on deadline. But they get down toward the goal line after the play, and you could see they show him. They keep cutting to Favre on the sideline.
Yep.
And he's got the baseball cap on, which is a clear indicator that his night is done finally. But you can see, and old Tausch is in the huddle, but he's got command of the huddle. Rodgers is, all right, here we go. Come on, let's go. We got to get in here. We go. And you could just see that there is a confidence, that there is a certainty. And perhaps that had grown as the game had gone on to that point. But he did not look, you hear coaches talk about it all the time. It's not too big for him.
Mm-hmm.
It was very clear that night that it was not too big for him.
Because and there are things that go awry, right? Like I mentioned the first, he gets pressure in his face right away. And it was clear the Cowboys' game plan, because they got after Favre so much, was when the Packers went to their 5 wide sets, they wanted to put pressure on whoever the quarterback was. So they continued to do that with Rodgers as well. He responded to that well. In that drive that I was talking about with Lee, again, he was sacked on the first play of that drive, sacked on the Packers' first offensive play in the second half. But a lot of quarterbacks are going to panic in that situation. They're going to start, the feet start moving fast. And that wasn't the case for him, because they end up picking up a first down later and they continue to move the ball down the field. It was their only possession in that third quarter, and then they ended up scoring a touchdown. It ended on a Ryan Grant 1-yard touchdown run. But Rodgers, after starting 1 for 4, ends up completing 11 or 12 passes in a row. Just really settles in. And as you said, that was the one thing I remember sitting in the bar at Platteville, just how in command he seemed of the offense. Oh, this guy knows what's going on. It wasn't one of those kind of fluky things sometimes when you see a backup quarterback come in, they start running around, they're making plays. I think of a Taylor Heineke who can scramble a little bit in some of the limited opportunities he's gotten for Washington. And you think, okay, maybe this guy's making plays, but there was nothing fluky about it. It was balls out on time. Every once in a while, use your athleticism to extend a play. And he was just not rattled. He was 100% ready for the moment and ready for the situation.
So, and as I watched it back, and I've got it going here while we're talking, I remember thinking this in the press box at Texas Stadium too, because there's a TV that, it's old school back then. We didn't have HD, so there were these little square TVs in the press box, and I'm writing my story, and I keep looking up. And they're showing Favre on the sideline, and he's got this kind of befuddled look.
Yes.
It's not excitement.
Yep.
It's not happiness.
Nope.
It's not disappointment. And I just remember thinking then, and it came back to me as I watched it again, God, I wonder what he's thinking. I think he was thinking, oh boy.
Yep.
Not saying that it's easy to take some shots at Brett these days after some of the things that have played out. And frankly, it's easy to take shots at Rodgers. A lot of people do that too. But it's 27-10 when Favre gets hurt and Rodgers goes in. Do I think it's possible that just like vindictive Rodgers wanted to outlast everybody that was involved with the drafting of Jordan Love, do I think that there was a tiny part of Brett Favre thinking, well, we're already in a 27-10 hole. I hope he plays poorly. I do think that. And if Brett sometimes wants to do a RePackables pod and refute that, he's welcome to. But I do think there was part of him that was like, oh boy. And that goes back to my point and about this kind of confirming what they already knew. And I'll never I'll never forget this conversation. Look, first of all, years later, Favre acknowledged when he was on with Tausch and I don't know if it was the time that he ended the call with "Love you guys" or not. Still never expected that to occur. But he basically said, "Look, I knew he was good. Like, you guys didn't see it till Dallas, but I also was kind of hoping that when the lights came on, he wouldn't be as good as he'd been in practice because he wanted to still be the guy." And so I think that was part of it. But the story that I will never, ever, ever forget, and what underscores the idea that the Packers already were pretty sure of what they had, and what happened in Dallas was just confirmation thereof, was the story that Brady Papinga, who was in Rodgers' draft class in 05, told Tausch and me about. And it was, I can't remember. They were having a party. And it was, I don't know if it was the Halloween party or a late Thanksgiving party, because the game is in Dallas after Thanksgiving.
The Thursday after Thanksgiving.
It's the Thursday after Thanksgiving. And so Brady Papinga tells this great story about my guy, John Schneider, having a few too many adult beverages at the party. And he's kind of slurring his words, and he's kind of, feeling pretty good. And I looked it up. Here's the quote. Brady says, "It was like the truth serum was in his veins. He's like, we got our guy, man. We got our guy of the future. Aaron is our guy. Did you see him play?" And he was adamant that day that they were done with Favre. That's what Brady says about him at this party.
Whoa.
And then, just to finish Brady's quote, Brady says, and the best thing was, after he told me that, he chases me down that Monday after, and he says, Brady, remember, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But they in the front office knew after that Dallas Cowboys game in 07 that it was time for Rodgers, and that was that. And I don't think Brady, I actually remember when Brady said this on our show, and I texted Schneider and I said, "Hey man, Brady just told a great story. I want to know A, if it's true, and B, if I can use it in a story in the future." And he's like, "Yeah, I was pretty drunk, but it's true." And we know what happened after that.
As for the ending of this game, the Packers did get the ball back after Al Harris got an interception in the end zone. Not because he made a great play, but because T.O. basically handed it to him.
Yeah.
For being as great as Terrell Owens is, like, the dude also has like some pretty inexplicable drops at times. This happened to be one of them. So that was the only time the Packers got the ball back with an opportunity to tie or take the lead in the second half. Aaron Rodgers ends up getting sacked on third down. Cowboys march down. They punch it into the end zone to take a 34-24 lead. Packers settle for a field goal. They essentially don't really get the ball back and eventually lose this game 37-27. But what do you remember, Jason, being at that game, going into the locker room, talking to Mike McCarthy after the game? Like, what do you remember about the locker room after the game? Because I got to imagine it's a little mixed, because the guys that are younger and maybe in the Rodgers camp, I would imagine would be pretty excited for their guy. But at the same time, this was a battle for first place in the NFC, and the Cowboys ended up getting home field advantage over the Packers. Now, it didn't matter because the Cowboys lost to the Giants and the Packers got to host the NFC Championship game, but it was a pretty big game in the grand scheme of things. But I got to imagine there were at least some mixed emotions in the locker room after the game.
Yeah, there's no question there were. So a couple things that I remember. First of all, I very vividly remember it's 27-24 and Al gets the interception. Mm-hmm. So, and the Packers, I don't know, they get to the 40 or the 50. They move the ball a little bit, but not into real threatening range to take the lead. But I remember after the interception thinking, oh my God, Rodgers is going to get the ball back and they're going to take the lead. Yeah. He's going to bring them all the way back from down 27-10 to up 31-27 or tie it at least at 27-27. And the opportunity was sure there. And what I remember most about Rodgers post game, and then I'll talk about the McCarthy and whatever else. But what I remember most in post game was how angry Aaron was that he didn't get it done. Like, I thought that was another glimpse into that this guy has, what it takes to potentially be the guy whenever Favre steps aside. Because, again, the other crazy thing about 08 was that for the first time in the Favre watch era, which really began in January of 2003 after they lost to the Atlanta Falcons at home in the 2002 playoffs, was for the first time in the Favre watch era, I thought there's no way this guy's not coming back next year. He turned back the clock. He had a renaissance season. Did he look like he didn't want to play in Chicago when it was cold and in the second half against the Giants? Yeah, but he was really, really good. He's still got good football in him. They're going to have to trade Rodgers because he ain't going to stick around. So I remember thinking that was the possibility. What I remember from that night, though, was Rodgers being mad at himself that he didn't get it done. I remember there being some veteran players, including my radio co-host, who didn't want to say things on the record, but were like, you see what the kid did? You see what he did?
Yeah.
And Tausch tells a great story about all these times that James Campen, their offensive line coach, after practice tape, would be stopping and rewinding throws that Rodgers would make in practice, reminding these guys, hey, that's special. That's not normal. And so Tausch knew, all those guys knew, right? And so they weren't going to come out and say, the kid's really good. They tempered their statements. I remember that very clearly. Because, look, Favre was going to start the next week. We knew he wasn't going to miss a start, right? Mm-hmm. He was going to get feeling back in his elbow. He's going to be fine. So I remember that. But I do remember Mike McCarthy, who I think, whatever differences they had later in their time together, I think he really liked Aaron a lot. And I think he still does, with the rough patches in the middle. But I think what's interesting was you could sense from him the confidence that he had. And while there was no moral victory of, oh, hey, we rallied and whatever else, I do think that there was a feeling of, hey, this is what we did with the kid. If we get things to fall our way, we got to see these guys again. We're going to beat them. And that I remember that feeling as well, because, look, Favre can't play like that again if we see him again. But these are two teams that are pretty much even. And as it turned out, as you said, the Giants ruined it for both of them.
Yes. And then went on to ruin it for the Patriots on top of that. They just ruined it for everyone throughout the entire NFL postseason that year. Any other things that stick out to you from this game, or anything that derived off this game?
So, first of all, speaking of the Giants, don't forget that was the year where they started the year with Strahan and all those guys, basically having a mutiny against Tom Coughlin. And then they end it by winning the Super Bowl over a team that was supposed to go undefeated, right? So that adds a whole different layer to that season. The thing that I remember most, though, when I look back on not just that game, but kind of the aftermath of that, is how much I kept thinking the what-if game, not just about that NFC Championship game, but I wondered, what if Rodgers doesn't do what he did in that game? And here's why I asked that. Because, I made that comment about, I wondered what Favre was thinking on the sideline. They went down to Chicago several weeks later, and it was cold. It was Favre and I both like to wear shorts in the wintertime. And he's older than I am. And he had reached a point in his career where the guy who was never bothered by cold was clearly bothered by cold. And I'll never forget the walk from the parking lot to the stadium. It's among the coldest times I've ever had in my life. but I wasn't playing football that day. And Favre looked like a guy who did not want to be in Chicago. And when you put that together with what Rodgers did in Dallas, that was the first time I started to think, is it possible that even if Favre does want to play, that they don't want him to? And we had some of those moments, all those parallels between Favre and Rodgers. We had some of those moments with Rodgers in recent months before he was traded to the Jets. So you take the game in Dallas, you take Chicago, and then you take what happens in the NFC Championship game, not knowing at the time the story about Rodgers and the idea of McCarthy contemplating benching Favre for him. And then those become the breadcrumbs that lead you to think, I wonder what the future holds at the quarterback position. And you could do a whole nother podcast on how Favre gave them the easy way out by announcing his retirement in March of 2008 and what it might have looked like otherwise had he not. But boy, oh boy, this was where it all started. And I would leave everyone with this. We want so many parallels between Favre Rodgers and Rodgers Love. But what Aaron Rodgers did in this game is not the same as what Jordan Love did in Philadelphia.
No.
Yes, they lost both games. But Jordan Love did it for 10 snaps. Aaron Rodgers did it for two and a half quarters plus. And it's not to the same degree. And I would argue, whether the Packers are willing to admit it or not, that the brain trust going into Dallas and then seeing what happened in Dallas, they thought they knew what they had, and then they got confirmation. In Philadelphia, I don't think they knew what they had. He played well in Philadelphia, Jordan Love did, but I don't think he played well enough for them to be certain of what they have. And I think that's a very big difference. We'll see how he does. I hope he does great. I keep saying it. People make fun of me for it. I really like Jordan. I hope he does really well because he's a really good kid. But that is not apples to apples. What happened on this night in Dallas is not the same as what happened 15 years later in Philadelphia with Jordan Love.
Jason, appreciate the time, bud. Can't wait to talk about Jordan Love going forward. This was great, kind of taking a look back 16 years ago when Aaron Rodgers got that first real significant playing time and gave a lot of people in Packers land a little bit of hope about life after Brett Favre.
So you're telling me with 7:51 left and the Packers down 34-24, I can turn it off now?
Yes, you can. Yes. Yeah, it's done. It's done. I mean, they'll kick a field goal. You'll miss Mason. I mean, Mason Crosby making field goals in Dallas. Good to know that goes all the way back to 2007 as well. Dude just loved kicking down there.
Well, we'll see if he's doing that in 2023.
Who knows? Jason, appreciate it, bud.
Anything for you, Gabe. You're the best.
We'll be back again next week with another episode of RePackables, all part of Pack Summer here on ESPN.